So what's exactly your job at Intel?
So my job as a futurist at Intel is to look 10 to 15 years out and model how people will act and interact with technology. I'm a principal engineer at the company, so it's my job to take social science and technical data and trends and economics and sometimes a little bit of science fiction and begin to model how people will want to interact with technology 10 years from now. And I do that simply because at Intel it takes 5 to 10 years to make the chip, and so it's a vital business importance today for people to know what Intel wants. It's a vital business importance today for Intel to know what people will want to do 10 years from now. So it's very geeky. I deliver a spec. I just finished up 2019, and I'm now working on 2021.
And so but is it basically a tech spec, or is it basically like a paper? Like saying we think this is where we're going, and you're looking at the different aspects of the interaction with technology.
So it's what's called an experience specification.
Okay.
So it's just that. So it's partially a technical spec, and then it's also partially pulling in all the research to give people a really well-rounded understanding. And sometimes it not only includes technical specs, but it'll include animations to show things. Sometimes it actually, the last one we did for 2019 had 2 science fiction stories as a way to show people, if this is a technology we're building, what would the human impact be 10 years from now? So it's really anything that we can do to get across the experience that people want to have. And then I work with them to turn that into the hardware requirements, the software requirements, the marketing work we need to do.
How did you end up doing this? What's your background?
So I have a dual background. I'm a principal engineer at the company, so I have a technical background, and then I have a design background as well. And I'm also a science fiction writer and a writer. So I was kind of born to do this, but I've always been a product guy. So ultimately, I am judged by the things that I build. And so I provide a spec to actually go and do all this work. Before that, I did work in interactive television. I did work in some smartphones and handhelds. So that was what I had done. And Intel brought me in as we began to work on the system on chip, on the SoCs, to create a specification that says this is what people want to do.
Okay. And if you look down to 2020,
yes,
what kind of things do you think we'll be using?
One of the most important things about 2020 is that the size of meaningful computational power, the size of the chips, begins to approach 0.
Okay.
So we're talking 14 nanometers or 7 nanometers. 7 nanometers is 21 atoms across. And that means the questions that we ask ourselves about the technology that we build fundamentally changes. For decades, we have to ask ourselves, can we do something? Can we make a laptop small enough to fit into somebody's pocket? Can we make a laptop small enough to fit in somebody's bag? Can we do it? Well, when you have the size of meaningful computational power being 0 or close to 0, it means you can turn anything into a computer. You could turn this desk into a computer, my jacket into a computer, even my body into a computer. So the question we don't ask is, can we do it? But what? What do we want to do, and why do we want to do it? And I think a lot of what you're seeing, what it's actually going to look like, is right out there. I mean, that idea of being able to take computational power and put it in a store. Have you seen the smart store? Have you seen the store yet?
Yeah.
So on the store, you can walk into a store, and if your child has an allergic reaction to nuts, it tells you don't buy these products. Mm-hmm. Those things could kill your child. Perfect, right? That's great. That the ability to take all this computational power and this intelligence and meaningfully make people's lives better, that's incredible. You take something like seeing through rain or seeing through snow that Justin showed this morning, by taking computational power and putting it into a headlight, you'll save people's lives. And to me, that's the most important part, is we can begin to see, and again, there's lots of instances in people's homes and all that type of stuff, that computational power won't just be about an ultrabook or a smartphone. It'll be about the environments that we live in. And that makes me very excited.
What's the main effect of the internet between humans and machines? The main effect between this relationship?
I can tell you what I think it should be. Well, I mean, ultimately, I think the goal should be, how do we make people's lives better? So much of what, when we look at all of these devices, the question I ask myself is, how do we use all of this computational power to make people's lives better? How do we make them healthier? How do we make them connected to the people that they love? How do we make them more productive? I think we've done that. I mean, I think one of the things that technology has done a great piece with is just connecting people. I think we are connected via these platforms, via smartphones and tablets and ultrabooks and the internet, in just profoundly meaningful ways. Like we were just talking about the Tomorrow Project. The Tomorrow Project allows us to take visions for the future from Brazil, from China, from Germany, and share it all over the world. And that, to me, is just incredible, because the effect that it can have is huge, absolutely huge.
I think another.
Sure.
I have a question about the real needs about technology, and how part of these needs are real, and which part is it's not real. It's fake. It's about it's fake.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. The way, in the work that I do, with the future casting work, the basis of everything that I do is social science. So we have ethnographers and anthropologists going out and studying people all over the world. Not studying technology, but studying humans. And not studying markets, not studying countries, studying people, real people. So that we're talking about flesh and blood people and how they communicate, how they shop, how they worship, how they interact with each other, to get an understanding of what people need. And that usually is where all of my work begins, is to understand what do people really need, what are people doing, and then to look at what the technology can do. Say, and this is all the geeky, nerdy stuff that we do inside of the labs, this is all the really, really cool things that could happen. And then I put those two things together to say, okay, how do we understand the human need, having nothing to do with technology, and then how can we use that technology to make their lives better? In my process, that's the first step in everything that I do, to keep myself honest, to understand that everything starts with humans and ultimately it comes back to people all over the world.
So you have to do a very good research.
Yeah.
In the basis.
So in Intel labs, we have had social scientists studying people for 15 years all over the world. I feel very fortunate that we have a team of social scientists. I'm not a social scientist. We have a team of social scientists that have been doing that, and they are constantly traveling all over the world. They've been to every continent except Antarctica, studying people. And
in Africa too? In Africa too?
Yeah, we've been doing a lot of work recently in Africa. And kind of, because again, it's we don't do it to understand markets. And people talk about economics. We're doing it to understand what people are doing and how, because ultimately that's who we're designing for.
Yeah, how can you see the Internet of Things in the future, for example, 10 years from now?
Well, that's, I think, a big question that we were talking before, is that when you have the ability to turn anything into a computer, right, the question becomes, what do you want to do with it? And to me, that's the main question for the Internet of Things, is that, I live my life pretty much 10 to 15 years in the future. I'm constantly thinking about the future. My family says I commute home on the weekends, but I live most of my life in the future. And so the question that I ask myself is, the Internet of Things and the ability to turn anything into a computer is happening. It will only happen more. This is coming. So then the question for me then becomes, what do we want to do with it? How do we use it in our lives? And I think a great these what's out on the floor at Research at Intel is great examples of that. The Internet of Things, it's just things. It doesn't matter. But when you make a store smart so it will never sell you something that has peanuts in it that will harm your daughter, that's good. That's what we should be thinking.
Is there a dark side in this, in the Internet of Things?
Yes. I think there's always a dark side.
What?
Well, I mean, I think that's the thing, that so much of when we look at technologies, they can always be used for good and they can always be used for bad. I mean, it's just like anything. Technology is just a tool. So for me, technology is just a hammer. right? And for me, a hammer, although human beings love to be enamored, we love our tools, we talk about our tools constantly, we write about our tools, we write about the newest tool, it doesn't matter. What matters is what the tool can do, right? And for me, a hammer is interesting, but a hammer is really important when you can use it to build a house. That is the thing. How will you use it?
And not to kill something.
But that's the other side, right? You cannot build a hammer that is designed to build a house and not be able to hit somebody in the head. You can't do it. So what we then begin to do is build social structures around it. We talk about those. We talk about those consequences because it's not the technology that's doing it, it's people. The technology doesn't get to decide what it does. We get to decide. Humans decide. And I think we need to have conversations about those dark sides. That's why I do so much work with science fiction, to say what could possibly go wrong and say, do we want to avoid this? How do we avoid it? So I spend a lot of time actually going in and thinking about those dark sides. But it usually has nothing to do with technology. It has to do with people and how humans could use it.
And do you think that the current level of knowledge of the world's leaders is sufficient enough for them to see the bright side of these new technologies and not try to stall their development because of their fears?
Human beings are very complicated, especially leaders and governments and companies. That for
Sorry, you're better.
I'm okay.
okay.
Okay, sorry.
Thank you.
So what I've seen in the past 5 years is a remarkable change. 5 years ago, especially when we were talking about privacy, security, data, we weren't having conversations about that. We weren't. Nothing like we are today. And to me, it's the conversation that's important. Right? The conversation that says, this is the future I want, this is the positive, this is the future I want to avoid, this is the negative. And we're starting to have those conversations for the first time in an in-depth way. That never ends. And it never does. We will continue because there is no right answer. But human beings are so complicated that the answer in Brazil will be different than in Mexico, than in Belgium, than in the US. I'm okay with that because that's what's great about human beings, is we are very diverse. And so I don't think there ever is an end point.
Okay.
But what I like is that we're starting to have that conversation more. And I think we need to push for it. Because only through those conversations about both the positive and the negative can we actually build something that's meaningful.
What's your take on 3D printing, for example?
I love 3D printing. I do. It's awesome.
Yeah.
That's what one of my talks was about today. I'm actually working on 3D printable robots.
Self-printing?
No, not self-printing robots. No. They don't get to decide. We get to decide. But what's that? No. That's the thing about robots. They're very nice. The robots just want to be our friends. The robots I'm building want to be our friends. But you can print 80% of the robot.
Okay.
So you can people can start making robots all over the world, which is this 21st century robot idea, that we can create robots that are our friends. That you could have a robot that's kind of like a smartphone with legs, that's just there to communicate and connect you with people and have fun and that type of thing. It's not there to change your tire or operate on you or kill you. It's just there to communicate, just like this isn't going to kill you. That's that type of idea. But the thing I think is really interesting about 3D printing is it is a significant shift. We're still very much in the early days of 3D printing. For me, a good parallel is desktop printing. So desktop printing radically changed the world in how we printed and how we did printed material. For me, 3D printing is a lot like desktop manufacturing. It didn't mean that books went away. It didn't mean that print shops went away. It just changed and shifted the economies of it. It allowed some people to print some things in their home, some things to print in the local shop, and some things to be sent to you. I think 3D printing has that capacity, but with stuff, with things, where we manufacture, how we manufacture, and how we replace, how we can continue to sustain the use of different objects and different things in our lives and not have to throw them away, because we can actually come up with print parts that will actually make them better. So I think it will have a very deep effect, but I think we're just seeing the beginning of it. Very, very early.
So I think we're at a point where processing power is less important than input. So what's Intel doing, or how do you see input being more important than processing power in the future? For example, voice control and gesture control and all this stuff. I was seeing the demo where you control the whole house. But this is right now very limiting.
Yeah.
You can only stand in a certain way and be very careful where you do the gesture. So how do you see this evolving?
So the specifically what you're talking about is why I have a job. Like that is the key point. So when you can turn anything into a computer, what matters is what we call I/O, input output, which is exactly what you're talking about. How do we talk to the computer, and how does the computer talk to us? Or more importantly, how do all the computers in our smart building, in our smart cars, in our smart cities, how do we all talk to each other? But it all comes down to input and output. And when we talk about it, we say it's experience. So I think you'll see out on the floor, and even when Justin and people were talking today, we talk about what's the experience we want people to have. Because we're trying to model the holistic understanding of how people will do that. And sometimes typing on a keyboard is great, but sometimes touch is better, sometimes speech is better. Even as you move a little bit forward, sometimes perceptual computing, so the ability for your device to know who you are, how you feel, what you're doing, really helps. And I think for us, it's understanding each of those so that we can architect that experience. And so our answer to that is, as a company, you'll hear us talking more about experiences, that we are driven by experiences, that we are an experience company, that it isn't just about the technology. The technology is important, but it's reached a point where experience and the imagination of what we could do with it is far more important.
We are monitored all the time for all the computers, smartphones, social networks. What is privacy in this context? Is it possible?
I think, privacy, so many times when I go out and talk to people all over the world about that, privacy comes up. And people talk about privacy as if it's a thing, as if it sits on the periodic table next to like helium, that we think it's a thing. Privacy isn't a thing at all. Privacy is a societal and cultural construct. Privacy in the US is radically different than privacy in the European Union, than in Brazil, than in any other place. Privacy is inherently human and cultural. So for us, what we're doing, going back to the social science work that we do, is understanding who values what in that privacy, who should own what, who should have control over what, and defining it. And it will continue to change. You know, the idea that everybody would have to have papers to cross borders so that we would all have to have passports a long time ago was an extreme invasion of your privacy. The fact that you would have to carry around those papers and the state would have to know who you were and track everything.
You still have the discussion about the national licensed driver.
Yeah. I mean, and you know, and you've got Social Security numbers in the U.S., you have these different ways. So I think for me, that when we start talking about privacy, and especially now, it's extremely important that our definitions of privacy, driven by technology, is changing. It is changing. And the question for me becomes not what is privacy, but what is the benefit? So if I give up information about myself, if I get a passport, that means I can come visit all of you, right? This is the positive effect of it. So for me, it's not that privacy isn't a finite thing, that we as humans, we as cultures, and we as the world need to have conversations about what we tell and what we don't tell. And also that privacy isn't binary, right? Meaning on, off, right? It doesn't work like that, right? In the way humans interact, when I meet you, I don't tell you everything about me. That would be silly. Why would I do that? We need to understand that there's much more subtlety. And I think we're finally getting to that point where 5 years ago, privacy was, I have privacy or I don't have privacy. And it doesn't work like that. Yeah, and it's got to have the subtleties of culture, the subtleties of human preference, the subtleties of that built into the technology. I think we need to hold our technology to that bar, to understand the subtleties of how we view privacy and reflect the human values of privacy.
And are you seeing that younger generations and older generations have totally different views of privacy?
So younger generations and older generations always have different views on everything.
On everything.
It ebbs and flows. Again, I think it changes. So what I find, so I'm not a social scientist,
Okay.
right? So, but I sit next to one, so I get a lot of this. What's interesting to me is when social networking first came out, everybody was telling everything about what we were doing. You were telling where you were and who you were with and taking pictures, everything. And then there started to be, a bit, people said, no, I don't know if I want to do that. And they said, well, you have a generation of people who all they want to do is share. What's interesting is we're beginning to see that generation not being on Facebook. That generation, and it's typified by a company called Snapchat.
Yeah.
So that idea that you can send something and that's sort of Snapchat, I can send you a picture and it goes away after a few minutes. I can set it. The idea that data disappears. That's really different. I even told the designers that they should put smoke that comes out so that when it disappears, it goes. But that's a really different idea. So if you think about Facebook 5 years ago, that idea that data would go away, you would say it's science fiction. But I think now we're starting to understand those subtleties. And you do have a whole generation that doesn't want things to stay around. And again, I think for me, I'm an optimist. But to me, it's positive that it's showing that our industry is maturing, that our culture is maturing to understand that there are subtleties about what we want to go away and what we don't want to go away.